speed of light. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, so the way it works is, you have these light sails. Like, you basically take these a spacecraft and you shine a laser at it, and the laser is insanely strong, quickly accelerated at 100 Gs, or no, I think it was 10,000 Gs, until it gets to 20% the speed of light, and then it goes on your merry way, right? So, if you want to be in like personally explore the Alpha Centauri system within like 2 centuries or one century, then being a robot is like by far the most practical way to do it, because there's no way that a human being can survive 10,000 Gs. So, and it's definitely interesting long term, but at the same time, like, there's definitely a lot of like psychological hangups and a lot of like deep philosophy that we'll just have to grapple with.
Well, I think
to get there.
I think what it hangs on the topic of whether we can convert consciousness into an engineering problem. So,
exactly.
like, is consciousness tied to our biology? Because the moment we can convert consciousness into a digital form, then we can send it with that light sail to Alpha Centauri. Until then, a robot is not carrying anything except maybe some basic knowledge like Wikipedia. It's not carrying the flame of human consciousness. I have high hopes for converting consciousness into an engineering problem. In fact, I think it's not as difficult as people think.
I agree with that. I'm definitely in the camp that consciousness is a property of the algorithm and not a property of brain structure. The other fun, like the kinds of philosophical things we'd have to grapple with is like, once you upload yourself, like you can hit Control C. It wouldn't it be lovely to have like 10 copies of Lex Friedman, and then like we could just get there.
I think what it hangs on the topic of whether we can convert consciousness into an engineering problem. So, like, is consciousness tied to our biology? Because the moment we can convert consciousness into a digital form, then we can send it with that light sail to Alpha Centauri. Until then, a robot is not carrying anything except maybe some basic knowledge like Wikipedia. It's not carrying the flame of human consciousness. I have high hopes for converting consciousness into an engineering problem. In fact, I think it's not as difficult as people think.
I agree with that. I'm definitely in the camp that consciousness is a property of the algorithm and not a property of brain structure. The other fun, like the kinds of philosophical things we'd have to grapple with is like, once you upload yourself, like you can hit Control C. It wouldn't it be lovely to have like 10 copies of Lex Friedman, and then like we could just interview everyone.
So I have to ask this question. It's a difficult one, which I don't think it'd be wonderful, first of all.
Sure.
So in the following way, and this has to do with immortality as well, there's something about scarcity that creates value. Or there's a bunch of philosophers, Viktor Frankl, Bernard Williams, Ernest Becker, they argue that death, or the scarcity of life, creates meaning. That the reason life is beautiful, the reason so many moments of experience of love or delicious food, all those things are made delicious because they're finite, because they end, and because we don't have that many of them. And there's a kind of worry that if we extend the human lifespan, if we achieve immortality, or if we, God forbid, clone me multiple times, then you lose the richness of what it means to have this life, to have this experience. Is that worry you at all? Do you think there's some aspect to which death does in fact give meaning to life?
I guess like the one historical parallel, and like this might be a bit unfair, is that there have been philosophers that have said things like war gives like meaning to human collectives, and the struggle for supremacy between nations and races is this like big driver of progress that that ensures that that everyone strives to be their best. And of course, this viewpoint got into the head of a crazy Austrian guy, and 20 years later, his soldiers were shooting at my grandparents. So, these days we don't really have that, but yet life still feels meaningful. We've still found other ways to, there's still a striving for technological progress. There's still, a striving for self-improvement in general. and it turns out that you don't actually need to have existential conflicts in order to have that. Now, maybe you need conflict, but we have other kinds of conflict, right? Like we have competition between businesses, competition between political ideologies, competition between projects, and so these are like whatever the psychological needs are, like there just are substitutes for it. So I guess so if we I'm trying to say I feel like once we start living to the age of 200, then like I'm just intuitively expecting that we'll see substitutes emerge in the same way.
Yeah, will create conflicts of other sorts that lead to less human suffering than wars do. Like we'll just start playing Diablo 4, 5, 6, and because you die in video games, so maybe we'll get some of the inkling of scarcity through the activities we partake in, as opposed to our own body dying. I mean, I feel shitty when I like you can. I remember in Diablo 3, you can play in hardcore mode, where if you die in the game, your character's dead. So maybe we'll get the richness of like what that we currently get from life by having like little artificial versions of ourselves that die.
Interesting enough, as I've just like personally spent more time in this world, I've started realizing that there is a concept of like real finiteness that still like exists, and it might even still be a thing that provides meaning that doesn't require anyone to actually die. Like, for example, like how many people from middle school or even high school of yours like do you still talk to regularly?
I happen to be close friends with like 4 or 5 of them.
Okay, well, like in my case, the answer is 0 for middle school and 2 for high school.
But you're right. It like, dropped.
Exactly, it drops a lot,
zero.
right? And so, like, there's a lot of these just like relationships that end up being very finite. A person changes I feel like a person changes enough of their worldview after 25 years. Wasn't there even a study about this? Something like a person and themselves 25 years later are about as different as like 2 different people or something like this. So, like, I mean, just like you can have conflict without bloodshed, I think, you can have finiteness and even, the necessary sorrows of finiteness that give meaning without like literally anyone having to end their life.
And hopefully, if we do extend our life, we'll figure out ways to extend the period of time where there's neuroplasticity.
Yes.
To where we could change our worldviews continually throughout that time. So you can have these different phases of life. I thought it would be fun to hear you speak a little Russian. Ты по-русски говоришь?
Да, конечно.
Как твои русские корни помогли тебе?
Это интересный вопрос.
Что можно сказать по-русски об этом?
Что можно сказать о моих русских корнях? Я, когда or in the middle of COVID, and I saw that the price just went up by 1,000%, and I was like, oh my, of all of them, but like, it was this very stressful time, and I did have to act quickly. Like I did manage to, make a lot of the donations before, like a few days before the great crypto crash happened. So it was, and it's difficult to like. Obviously, there's parallel universes in which I did better, but at the same time, there's also lots of parallel universes where, because I hesitated more and tried to spend more time thinking, I missed the opportunity. So, on net, it's like a luck of the draw, and I'm just, happy that everything was able to turn out as well as it did.
But psychologically, you mentioned stress. How hard was it?
Stressful, right? I think, well, one of the really stressful parts was just the fact that I had to basically move all of my funds, including the 325,000 Ether from one cold wallet into another hot wallet, into another multi-sig wallet. And, maybe the multi-sig wallet had a bug in it. Maybe there's like some mistake I'll make in the middle that causes the funds to get lost. Like, that part was stressful, and I was definitely stressing out for 2 days. I mean, triple checking the new wallet. I even did a bit of an audit of the code myself. I wrote my own JavaScript dApp to make confirmations because Gnosis Safe didn't work with the status wallet well. So there was that whole thing was definitely a bit of a marathon. I was also kind of definitely a bit worried about, or uncertain, I guess, how the public and, including the coin communities would perceive the whole thing. but I was actually impressed. Like for every poster that was saying like, no, why did Vitalik like rug pull on us? His wallet was supposed to be a burn address. There was like 10 people that were like, oh, I thought I was just in this because it's a fun pyramid gambling thing, but instead I ended up being part of this great public good thing for humanity, and that's like even more amazing. So the amount of that I got was very impressive. So all in all, I think the dog people did great.
The dog people. Is there something you can extend to the bigger picture of it in the principles you apply to making this decision? Is there some principles, philosophies that you apply also to the decisions you make around Ethereum?
I think a big one for me is just this idea that crypto, isn't just an opportunity to give people like slightly better ways to save value and all of these things. Like it's also an opportunity to like basically create these like new digital institutions that could like serve the public good in new ways. And that's something that I've been interested in for a long time. I actually even have this article in Bitcoin Magazine back in 2014 where I basically suggested this idea that you would have coins that represent causes, and like people would just like buy and accept those coins because they support those causes. So I think it's called Markets, Institutions, and Currencies: A New Form of Social Incentivization, or something like that. And I'm sure you can find it and throw it in the links. So that was interesting to kind of see becoming real. And like in general, right, I think public goods are very important, and on the internet, public goods are even more important, right? Like every single Lex Friedman podcast is just on YouTube, and anyone can go and see it. Like there's no way for you to like sell it and so that some people can see it, but then other people can't see it. Like you could do that, but then you'd obviously be reducing your impact. So thank you for making the amazing Lex Friedman podcast so freely available.
Well, that's actually a tense thing. Is how do you do it in a way that's not controlled in a centralized fashion? Because actually, YouTube feels free and open, but it nevertheless is one company making centralized decisions. And the first time I realized YouTube is not forever is when a lot of the Joe Rogan Experience library was pulled from YouTube as part of the Spotify deal. And it made me realize we need to, it's like the realization that fiat money is centralized, is realizing that, this is not forever, and you might want to come up with schemes to distribute it, to decentralize the control of it in a way that audio for podcast is with just an RSS feed.
Exactly. And I think one of the kind of philosophical things that I hope to achieve is kind of decouple the concept of public goods, which are incredibly important and are the lifeblood of modern civilization, from the idea that there like, is or can be one central organization that represents the public and like perfectly understands and can impose their idea of what is the good. Right? Like it's when people talk about public goods, like it just often comes with this baggage of either centralization or conformism. And I think like it doesn't have to, right? Like often the most important public goods are the ones that are created by the crazy individualists that disagree with everyone else. So trying to make this kind of synthesis where you combine the values of decentralization and the values of open source, but you're not naive about it, and like you realize that for these things to be produced, there needs to be a way for it to be sustainable. There needs to be some way of supporting people who are working these projects, but at the same time, you want to avoid that turning into a vector of centralization, like trying to sort of get all of the good things without the bad things. To me, that's a big part of sort of what my grand experiment in crypto is about. Right? And like we are doing things in different kinds of things for this, right? Like there's the Gitcoin grants quadratic funding in the Ethereum ecosystem. There's obviously these dog coins that just happens like I guess accidentally. There's other projects that, like for example, Uniswap has their Uniswap DAO that just has a huge amount of funding, and like we haven't seen yet how that's going to be done, but it could be potentially deployed to do lots of really good and amazing things.
Do you see Ethereum as essentially a mechanism to fight for social causes?
I definitely see Ethereum as being a mechanism to fight for definitely some specific things that are social causes, like just the fact of creating an open financial system that anyone can participate in no matter where they are in the world. That's a social cause. Just giving people the ability to organize and create projects, even if it's 5 people in 5 different countries. And like that kind of inclusiveness, I think that's a social cause, and it's a core crypto value. But then at the same time, like the other important kind of part of the magic of Ethereum that you have to balance that against is that it is also this open platform where ultimately, the things that are on Ethereum is just the things that the community makes of it.
Well, you kind of briefly opened the door, so let's go there. When it comes to government regulation of crypto, what's the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario in terms of, as you've kind of mentioned, Ethereum challenges the power centers of the world, and how do you see the interplay between governments and this new technology that resists centralized power? Best case and worst case.
The best case is that blockchains continue to prosper and we figure out scalability so that people can actually start doing things on all of the amazing use cases that people have been talking about, instead of today where a lot of the great stuff gets priced out because transaction fees are at $5 to $10, and then we see a lot of different amazing applications happening on blockchains. It could be like DAOs creating new ways for people to interact and organize with each other, new ways for artists to get funded, and just all sorts of these amazing things. And there's just enough public support and just enough people that see that look, crypto is clearly doing a lot of good things, and there are definitely areas where there's tensions, but in those areas where there's tensions, like there could be some kind of creative and interesting approaches that get figured out, right? Like the concept of corporate taxes, for example, right? Like it doesn't it that would disappear as a revenue stream if theoretically corporations just all get replaced by DAOs. But I don't know, like maybe there's some other creative way by which DAO, like DAOs themselves can kind of be have some kind of encoded governance that ensures they have at least some kind of bias towards serving the global public good. And maybe it does enough of DAOs can do enough of that people are happy with it. And there are going to be things that people are unhappy about. There's always going to be the people that wants to surveil everyone. But if on the kind of effect of crypto from just empowering people is greater than that and greater than that in a way that people can just easily see, then that would be a good scenario, right? And we'll just like become kind of incorporated and accepted the same way as happened with the internet. But the worst case scenario would, of course, be just like people suddenly, flipping and going into moral panic mode and just, oh my God, like this technology is used by like, insert bad group of the day. And then I don't think governments have the ability to ban crypto to the extent of preventing blockchains from existing, but they definitely have the ability to really marginalize it, right? Like if you just ban all exchanges, and ban all links from the fiat ecosystem to crypto, and you ban all kind of mainstream employers from accepting or paying in cryptocurrency, then you can successfully turn it into a fairly kind of niche counterculture thing that has much less impact than it otherwise would. So it's somewhere between the good scenario and the bad scenario. I'm obviously hoping for the good.
Well, that's interesting. Also, the tension between governments and companies. Like if you have a bunch of billionaires or a bunch of companies like Tesla investing in Bitcoin, and then governments resisting that, it's interesting who wins out in that worst case scenario. And it almost when companies and rich, quote unquote, respectable people embrace cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, Ethereum, so on, even the dog coins, it's almost sends a signal to everybody else that this is a revolution that's here to stay.
Mm-hmm.
On this one little tangent that you brought up, this is almost an outdated idea, but it's still with us, which is cryptocurrencies are used for illegal activity, for drugs, for crime, and so on. Is there some sense that worries you that if cryptocurrency, if Ethereum runs the world, then crime, making money from crime will be easier?
There's always that possibility, but like at the same time, I think if you look at the world as a whole and like the way all the other technological trends are going, like in-person surveillance is just going up every year, right?
Yeah.
Like if you commit a crime in meat space, it's getting harder and harder to get away with it. So like if he wants to do something, and this is something that's just like happening as a result of just better technology, information transparency. Like a lot of it's hard to prevent even if you really tried. So the world where like things go dark to such an as the police hawks sometimes like to say, to such an extent that like oh my god, the criminals are committing crimes with impunity and we can't see anything, like that just seems unlikely. But on the other hand, like the world where there just is no privacy, for example, or the world where there just like is no ability to kind of act outside of the confines of mainstream institutions, like some that's something that's more realistic, and that seems like something that could lead to a lot of scary things, right? And like even from a government's point of view, right? Like I think governments over the last few years, a lot of them, they're very worried about sovereignty. They're worried about like if their countries, economies, and social environments are just completely dependent on basically foreign tech companies controlled by foreign governments. Like governments are not on team government, right? It's like the Indian government is on team India, the Russian government is on team Russia, and so forth, right? So like they don't want the U.S. to be able to like have this big backdoor into everything. So I mean, I do think that a balance is needed, but at the same time, I do think I guess I definitely like worry more about the possibility that just like without things like crypto, kind of acting outside of institutions becomes too impossible. And I don't even necessarily mean outside of governments, even just outside of corporations, like becomes too impossible, and there's just like terrible things that come as a result. If things going in the other direction, like it obviously is a risk, but at the same time, I think in the long term, like a crypto can potentially even like offer defenses as much as attacks against that sort of thing.
Yeah, throughout history, many of the most destructive things came from centralized institutions versus sort of from the people operating in the shadows. And I've been talking to a bunch of psychedelics folks, that people doing researchers like Greg Doblin in Johns Hopkins. There's a lot of exciting research on psychedelics. And one thing you could say about operating at the edge of legality, it could actually accelerate the adoption of particular things, like whether it's marijuana or psychedelics. They can help people out. It almost accelerates the policy. It forces the policy to catch up to where the people stand.
Right.
So there's a positive way of doing things that are in the gray area of legality, and creating a market that allows people to in a safe way be able to participate in this gray area of legality.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing to keep in mind, of course, is that the set of like the kinds of things that just like payment processors as companies try to restrict you from is much larger than the set of things that's illegal, right?
Right.
Like part of that is because they want to be super conservative, and like the more layers you have, the more they're like conservative because they're scared of what the layer below them will do to them. Sometimes they have their own, moral opinions of various kinds. Like they go after lots of people, right? Like they make life really hard for, like sex workers, for example, psychedelics, as you mentioned. There's a lot of activity, even including stuff that is totally legal, that just, there's this like, shadow like PayPal credit card government or whatever you want to call it. And I mean, that makes it just hard to participate in this stuff. So I think like reducing the number of intermediaries is definitely normally a good thing.
All right, let's talk about one of the most exciting technologies, like technically, philosophically, like socially, financially, in every way, which is Ethereum 2.0. There's a million things to talk about, but at the step one is probably a good thing to do, which is, can you briefly summarize your vision, how Ethereum 2.0 will make Ethereum more scalable, secure, and sustainable?
Sure. So I think recently we've actually been kind of de-emphasizing the ETH 2.0 branding, I guess. So the reason behind that was that originally we envisioned something more like a big grand event where, all the good things would happen at the same time, and it would be a new blockchain, and it would be a new protocol, and people would have to take a lot of effort to migrate over. But later we've slowly changed the roadmap over to something that's much more incremental. Right. So, proof of stake happens kind of over time, and then sharding gets added over time, and all these features get added over time. And so the experience for just a regular Ethereum user still feels very seamless, right? It's like maybe a little bit more complex than the hard forks that we've already done from a user's point of view, but like not by that much, right? So the big two things that are happening, right? These are what used to be considered the two flagship features of ETH 2.0, and now they're just, the flagship features of the, the next evolution of Ethereum.
Yes.
Yeah, as proof of stake and sharding. Right. So proof of stake is a consensus algorithm. It's or a consensus mechanism, I should say. It's the difference is that like an algorithm is something that you run by yourself. A mechanism is like it involves like interactions between people, and it could even include incentives and all of that. So a consensus mechanism, so by which nodes in the network agree on, which blocks came in, which transactions came in what order, make sure that once a block gets accepted, it can't get reverted, and all of these things that we expect from a blockchain. So existing blockchains, including Bitcoin, including the Ethereum of today, and including a lot of them, they use proof of work, right? So the reason why we need proof of anything is because like they serve this function that I call kind of economic Sybil resistance. So that's obviously a big word for, especially if you've never heard of Sybils before. But like the basic idea is right that you have a network and you have lots of computers that agree on like which block to accept, and sometimes you get two blocks that get published at the same time, and you just have to agree on an order. So there has to be some kind of voting game. Yeah, but then the question is, well, in this voting game, who gets a vote, who gets to participate? Now, you can't say one person, one vote, right? The reason why you cannot say one person, one vote is because you need some kind of like authority or some kind of mechanism to say, who the humans are, like, and if you don't have that, then a bad guy could just come in with a virtual machine or with a computer that has on it 10 billion virtual machines that have 10 billion, virtual nodes, and then just like say, look, I'm 99% of the network. I should control everything. So to prevent this, what proof of work and proof of stake both do is they basically say, well, the weight of your vote, like how much influence your votes have in the consensus, is proportional to like what quantity of economic resources you bring in. So in the case of proof of work, you prove what economic resources you have because your economic resources are computers, and you prove that you have them by just running them 24/7 using these hash algorithms, right? So this does solve the problem, right? Because in order to attack the network, you have to come in with more computers and like more money invested into computers and electricity than the rest of the network put together. And that's extremely expensive. In proof of stake, instead of relying on people with computers that are just constantly cranking out hashes 24/7, as your like unit of economic resources, you just use like holdings of coins inside the system, right? So all of these blockchains, they have some kind of coin in them. Bitcoin has Bitcoin, Ethereum has Ether. They all have a coin. So why not just use that as the the economic resource that you're using to like measure participation. So that's like the core distinction between proof of work and proof of stake. I like proof of stake, and I've liked proof of stake for many years, basically because like it just requires much less ongoing resource consumption. Right, like with proof of work, you have to like actually go and buy these physical computers, and these days, they have specialized hardware, ASICs, application-specific integrated circuits. You have to go produce them, you have to go buy them, and unless you have millions of dollars, you have to buy them from one of these other people who creates them, and those other people often end up taking a huge cut of the profits themselves. And then you have to plug them in. You have to just burn all of this electricity that's just running 24/7. So it consumes a huge amount of energy, right? And and not just energy, it also, just to create the hardware, right? Like people focus a lot on energy, but like actually about half the cost of proof of work mining is the cost of the hardware. So hardware is a very big deal too. And you need this really big and powerful, like very specialized hardware, the kind that fills up these big warehouses. So proof of stake, you don't really need that much electricity. You just need just a little bit to run a regular computer. You can run proof of stake validators on computers that you already have. So it's just much less resource intensive. And like this is good for a few reasons, right? Like one is the kind of environmental rationale that you're not breaking the environment. The second is that you're not taking away electricity and like other resources from other people. Right, like right now, I think just today I saw a story about like Iran wanting to shut down some Bitcoin mining because it was just grabbing up so much electricity that it was outbidding the nearby towns, and they just didn't have enough. And then there is like Chia, the one that's doing proof of like hard disk mining, basically is just like grabbing up so many hard disks, so there's a shortage, right? So that's the second reason. And then the third, more selfish reason is that because participating in consensus does not require so much energy expenditure, you don't need to pay people as much to participate, right? So like Bitcoin and Ethereum, they both issue somewhere around 4% of the total supply every year right now to miners. So Ethereum is about 4.7 million Ether, and the current supply is about 115 million. But with proof of stake, like we expect it'll be somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million per year. So that means the supply doesn't have to increase so quickly. So
one of the pros that that people sort of argue for the proof of work is that it is secure because it's much more difficult to sort of, as you've highlighted, it's difficult to participate. What are your thoughts about the security of the proof of stake mechanism? Is there ways to make it secure?
So I think proof of stake is very secure because in order to be able to attack the system, you need to have like basically as much stake as the rest of the network, right? So that means like right now, for example, we have 5 million ETH staking. So you have to come up with 5 million ETH and then join the network. And then the other, so 5 million ETH is a lot, right? It's like, how much is it now? Like $15 billion. So that's actually more than I believe the cost of attacking the Bitcoin network. And then the second thing is that recovering from attacks is much easier in proof of stake than in proof of work, right? Because in proof of stake, you have, like, first of all, we have, for many kinds of attacks that you do against this network, we have this concept of like automatic slashing, right? Which basically means that in order to like revert a finalized block. So if there's one block that's like accepted by the network and you try to convince the network to kind of revert that block and accept a different block, in order to make that kind of attack, you basically have to have your validator, like a big portion of your validators, sign two conflicting messages. And this is something that, like, once these messages are on the network, like, you can go and prove, like, look, these people did it. And so we have this feature in the protocol called slashing, where you basically take all these people who provably misbehaved and you burn their coins, right? And you don't burn anyone else's coins. Now, there are other cases, like, for example, if instead of reverting blocks, the attack just tries to censor everyone, right? Then what you do, everyone who got censored would just like basically create the minority chain, and then the community would basically have to do a soft fork, right? They would just have to say like, look, this chain is clearly attacking us. This chain is the one not attacking us, and so we're going to join this chain. And then what happens is that on that new chain, the attackers also lose a lot of coins. right?
Yeah.
So the difference between proof of stake and proof of work is that in a proof of stake system, like you can identify specific participants and you can say, these, and like this isn't like, a human going in and saying, I don't like you, I don't like you, I don't like you. This is like automated, right? You can
So the slashing process is automated.
Yes.
Is there ways it can go wrong? So that's a painful process where the coins are burned.
It is painful, yes. I think, the one big unknown, of course, is like if an attack actually happens, and like if an attack happens that requires the community to actually choose one of these minority forks, then like what would the community actually successfully coordinating on this look like, right? Like it's like we can talk about it and we can write like science fiction novels about it, but like until it's happened, you don't really know the details of like what it looks like and how difficult it is.
What are the channels of communication for the community? If you can enlighten me a little bit, like where in many ways in the political realm, Twitter is often used as a way to kind of have these emergent phenomena of large groups of people coming to a consensus about a particular idea. And then there's battle for consensus. What's in the Ethereum community, what are the sources of natural language based communication that have an emergent belief structure that you would say? Or is it all through money? Is it all through trading that the communication happens?
There's definitely talking as well. I mean, like we have to agree on protocol changes somehow, right? Like there's Twitter, there's Reddit, there's GitHub, there's all of the various Ethereum forums, Ethereum magicians, Ethereum research. There's just in-person communication. Then there's just kind of like the hidden web of everyone talking to everyone on Telegram or Signal. So it's like some of everything, right? Like I think like the thing to emphasize around like can you actually come to consensus on whether or not to fork the chain because the attacker is censoring everyone, just for example, is like everyone who's running a node is going to see almost the same thing, right? Like they're going to be off by a few seconds, and like maybe they'll be off by a few minutes. They'll disagree by a few minutes, but like if it's a serious attack, people are going to know, right? It's not like one of those things where we're trying to agree on like I don't know, did Epstein kill himself or like some random political facts where like in reality no one knows a single thing about what's actually going on and they're all speculating. Like it is much more visible, right? So we do have that, but at the same time I'm happy to admit that like these are fairly untested mechanisms, but like at the same time they're also untested mechanisms in proof of work, right? And like in proof of work it's even harder because in proof of work you don't have the ability to like identify and say like I'm going to these miners attacked and so we're not going to let these miners in, these miners not attack, so we're going to keep them in. Like you have to pretty much either take out none of the miners or you do a fork that changes the proof of work algorithm which takes out all of the miners, right? So the economics of recovering from attacks in proof of work, at least to me, actually do seem like more unfavorable. But I'm sure the proof of work people you talk to will give very different and contradictory opinions, and that's totally fine and amazing.
Some people describe MEV, miner extractable value, as an existential risk to Ethereum. What is MEV? How important is it to solve an MEV? If it's important, what ideas do you have?
Sure. How about after this one, we'll also talk about sharding because it's amazing and it's part of it.
We'll return back to sharding, and we'll return to the big picture of the scaling problem, as you mentioned.
I love this conversation. Depth first search instead of breadth first. So basically, okay, MEV, miner extractable value. It is not different in proof of work and proof of stake, right? So like if you want to call it, block proposer extractable value, like it sounds less sexy, but we can call it BPEV instead of MEV. Who cares? But
this is a problem in both proof of work and proof of stake.
Yes. So the basic idea is that if you have the ability to choose which transactions go into a block and in what order, then you have the ability to like take advantage of that position for economic gain in a lot more ways than just collecting transaction fees, right? Like for example, there's decentralized exchanges on chain like Uniswap. And like let's say the price of ETH versus USDC was 2,700 the previous block, but then there was a bit of a market drop, and now it's 2,680. Where you can go on Uniswap and you can just like gobble up the entire part of the automated order book that's like between 2,700 and 2,680, right? And then at the same time you like run a bot and you buy some ETH back at 2,680, and you've just like made about $10 of profit, right? So, or well, $10 times whatever the depth is, right? So there's lots of little things like that. There's also things that involve like front running other people's transactions. So one example of this would be that if someone sends a transaction that says, like, I don't know, buy me 5 ETH for whatever price that you can get, but with a maximum of let's say $15,000, then you can go and you can put a transaction right in front of that transaction, and you can like buy up that ETH first, and then you resell it to him at $15,000 minus one. So
and then you get to make a little bit of money that way.
Exactly. So there's a lot of these different like arbitrage, front running, back running, these different tricks that allow block proposers to
get some percentage on top, like overhead.
Exactly.
Okay,
and the reason why this is a challenge is because first of all, it sometimes degrades user experience because users get less favorable trades. But there are sometimes ways to like mitigate that for applications. Sometimes it's not that bad. But like the bigger risk that I think some people consider more existential is that there's just much more economies of scale in figuring out how to extract all this revenue. Right? Because if you're just collecting transaction fees, there aren't really economies of scale. There aren't really benefits to centralizing, right? Because it's a very simple formula. You just like grab up the transactions that pay you the most. But with MEV, there's all sophisticated algorithms, and if you have lots of money, then you can hire really smart people to make amazing algorithms, and then you can use the other half of your money to get a lot of mining power or a lot of stake, and you get a lot of opportunities to use your even better algorithms. So there's this risk that like as a result of this, mining is basically or even validating proof of stake is going to centralize. So I think the ecosystem's best reply to this sort of risk, and it's the direction where projects like Flashbots are going already, is if you can't eliminate the centralization, then you try to firewall it, right? And the way that you firewall it is you basically say, we're going to try to deliberately create a marketplace where people can just do the complicated work of creating what are called bundles, like the bundles of transactions that like are very profitable, right? And then at the other side of the market, you just have like block proposers reminders that are just dumb nodes, and they go and ask the what are called searchers, the bundle creators, and they just ask like, hey, like how much can you give me if I put in your bundle? And then they just take the highest offer, right? So you sort of separate out the task, and you have the easy part, and then you have the hard part, and you have like this special class of actor called a searcher that does the hard part, and then the easy part, the people doing the easy part, which is just miners and validators, they kind of just talk to all the different people doing the searching, and they just accept the highest bidder, right? So, this is also just like an interesting example of like economic design philosophy, right? Like sometimes you can't just like make centralization go away. Sometimes it's inevitable, but at least you can try to kind of contain it. You can direct it, or you can even sort of firewall it away from core consensus.
It's just a little. It's a bit of a problem.
But I'm definitely approaching it with the mindset of this is a problem, and like yes, we do have to do some work to solve it, but we're doing it, and so far it's being solved.
Okay, let's talk about the other really fascinating part of the future of Ethereum. Let's not call it Ethereum 2.0, but the future of Ethereum that also may require a hard fork. I don't know. You can correct me on this. Is broadly ideas for scaling.
Yes.
And more specifically, sort of layer 2 or layer 1 and 2 intersection ideas of how to achieve scaling. And at the core of that is the idea of sharding. So first, what is sharding?
Okay. So there's two major paradigms for scaling blockchains, right? As you said, layer 1 and layer 2. And layer 1 basically means make the blockchain itself capable of processing more transactions by having some mechanism by which it can do that, despite the fact that there's a limit to the capacity of each participant in the blockchain. And then layer 2 says, well, we're going to keep the blockchain as is, but we're going to create clever protocols that sit on top of the blockchain that still use the blockchain and then still kind of inherit things like the security guarantee of a blockchain. But at the same time, a lot of things are done off chain. And so you get more scalability that way. So in Ethereum, the most popular paradigm for layer 2 is rollups, and the most popular paradigm for layer 1 is sharding.
So one way to achieve layer 1 scaling is to increase the block size.
Yes.
Hence the block size wars, quote unquote. And you actually tweeted something about people are saying that Vitalik changed his mind about he went from being a small
blocker went from being big to small.
Big to small. And but you said I've been a medium blocker all along. So maybe you can also comment on the very basic aspect before we even get to sharding of where you stand on this block size debate.
Sure. So the way that I think about the trade-off is I think about it as a trade-off between making it easy to write to the blockchain and making it easy to read the blockchain. Right. So when I say read, I just mean, have a node and actually verify it and make sure that it's correct and all of those things. And then by write, I mean send transactions. So I think for decentralization, it's important for both of these tasks to be accessible. And I think that they're about equally important, right? If you have a chain that's too expensive to read, then everyone will just trust a few people to read for them. And then those people can change the rules without anyone else's permission. But if, on the other hand, it becomes really expensive to write, then everyone will move on to basically second layer systems that are incredibly centralized. And that takes away from, decentralization and self-sovereignty as well. So this has been my viewpoints pretty much the whole time, right? It's that you need this balance, and going in one direction or the other direction is very unhealthy. In the Bitcoin case, basically what happened was that Bitcoin originally, at the very beginning, it didn't really have a block size. It just had an accidental block size of 32 or a block size limit of 32 megabytes, because that just happens to be the limit of the peer-to-peer messages. But then,
interesting. I didn't even know that part.
Yeah, but then Satoshi back in 2010 was worried that even 32 megabyte blocks would be too hard to process, so he put the limit down to 1 megabyte. And I think
by put, you mean sneaked in there?
Yeah, just made an update to the Bitcoin software that made blocks bigger than one. I think it's 1 million bytes invalid. And I think the impression that most people had at the time is that this is just a temporary safety measure, and over time, as we become more confident in the software, that limit would be raised somewhat. But that then, when the actual usage of the blockchain started going up, and then it started going up first to 100 kilobytes per block, then to 250 kilobytes per block, then to 500 kilobytes per block, there started kind of coming out of the woodworks this opinion that no, that limit should just not be increased. And then there are all of these attempts at compromising, right? First there was a proposal for 20 megabyte blocks. Then there was the 248 proposal, which is a bit ironic because the 248 proposal started off being a small block negotiating position. But then when the big block people came back and said hey, aren't we going to do this? They're like, oh, no, we don't want the block size increases anymore. So there were these two different positions, right? The small blockers, I think they valued 1 megabyte blocks for two reasons. One is that they just really, really believe in the importance of being able to read the chain. But two is that a lot of them really believe in maintaining this norm of never hard forking, right? So the difference between a hard fork and a soft fork is basically that in a soft fork, blocks that were any block that's valid under the new rules was still valid under the old rules. So if you have a client that verifies according to the old rules, then you'll still be able to accept the chain that follows the new rules. Whereas with a hard fork, you have to update your code in order to stay on the chain. And look, they have this belief that soft forks are kind of either less coercive than hard forks, which, by the way, I completely disagree with. I actually think soft forks are more coercive because, like, basically they force everyone who disagrees to sort of go along by default. Or they have this opinion that there's like it's more difficult to abuse soft forks to do really mean things, or that like completely violate people's expectations, like increasing the supply, which is like, I think there is some truth to that. So because of these reasons, they just say we're only going to do soft forks, and we want to just not do any hard forks. And they eventually discovered this idea called segregated witness that allows for like a very tiny block size increase to like the equivalent of about 2 MB with a soft fork. It's just a really like weird and devious trick. Like basically what they do is they take the